Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. I want to look at some case studies today of the political and economic issues that define the period from the 1980s to the present. And there will just be a few of these, and then we'll move on and talk about, give some concluding comments about, and talk a little bit about Africa's future, at least the interpretation that a lot that political pundits and historians and others have given to it, or at least define some of the issues that will continue to animate Africa as it moves into the future. A couple of examples that we've followed for some time in this course: Egypt and South Africa. From the assassination of Anwar Sadat by an anti-Israeli protester in 1981, I believe. Sadat, if you recall, had made peace with Israel, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, along with Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel. This was an unpopular move, especially among kind of Muslim and Arab hardliners in Egypt. And Egypt really, from the time of Nasser, had taken prime position of leadership in the Arab world. And so Sadat's capitulation to Israel was really not well received by a lot of people, but he was assassinated. And Hosni Mubarak, who was one of his lieutenants, took over. And for 3 decades, Mubarak ruled Egypt as a de facto dictator. Even though there were elections, they were rigged, kind of sham elections. Mubarak controlled nearly every facet of the government, had a widespread network of officials and bureaucrats and army officers in his pay, so to speak, loyal to him. The chief opposition to the Mubarak regime, as it was, frankly, to the Sadat and Nasser regimes, was the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. We talked about this. The Muslim Brotherhood had become increasingly radicalized, especially via the teachings of Sayyid Qutb, whom we discussed last class and our last lecture. And the Muslim Brotherhood was technically illegal, but it did command the loyalty of a large swath of the population of Egypt, as well as many prominent members of government who ran for political office under different parties, but who were really listening in many ways to the Muslim Brotherhood leadership. And in 2011, the spring of 2011, Egypt was one of the first places to experience the Arab Spring. This was an incredible phenomenon that rocked the Middle East that spring. Largely organized through social media, this led to massive protests. This is Tahrir Square in Cairo, pictured in the upper left-hand part of the slide here. One of the protests during the Arab Spring against the corruption of the Mubarak regime, often led by the kind of Islamic fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood leaders who were calling for the overthrow of the secularists and the establishment of a regime dictated by Sharia law. That didn't necessarily animate everybody in the Arab Spring. This was a tremendously exciting period of time in the Middle East, where regimes were toppled or were forced to make reforms. In some cases, regimes cracked down and tried to deny any kind of reform, but it was a really important sequence of events. And this led ultimately to the overthrow of Mubarak. Why Mubarak was able to be toppled is a complicated issue. One of the main factors actually is that there was mandatory conscription into the Egyptian army. Every male in Egypt, I suppose there were some exemptions that could be had, but every male was supposed to serve a period of time in the army, and so everyone was familiar with the army. It was really a popular institution in Egypt, and it came by 2011 really to constitute kind of the voice of the people, or the will of the people. And the army officers ended up turning against, a lot of them, and a lot of powerful ones ended up turning against Mubarak, and it was really the army that forced Mubarak out of office, and the army took over the leadership of the country and agreed to preside over. Sorry, it's late while I'm recording this, and I'm a little tired here. So, agreed to preside over the drafting of a new constitution and a new round of democratic elections in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which technically, again, had been illegal, was able to come out of the shadows. Many of the people associated with this, the Muslim Brotherhood, founded new parties, so it wouldn't look necessarily like the Muslim Brotherhood was like pulling the strings or anything. One of these figures, Mohammed Morsi, was elected president of Egypt in 2012. And Morsi very quickly issued an executive declaration stating that he could make any changes to the constitution without any kind of oversight by parliament, granting him essentially de facto dictatorial powers. And as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, even though he ran, as I said, under a different party called the Freedom and Justice Party, he was very much a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and there were protests against this. This touched off a whole new round of protests in 2012, late 2012, stretching into 2013. Morsi tried to backpedal some, but these protests reached a kind of fever pitch, and the army once again stepped in. And under the leadership of a general named Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Morsi was overthrown and imprisoned. And el-Sisi ended up retiring from the army and running for president. And he was elected president in mid-2013 in an election that was called free but not necessarily fair, because the Muslim Brotherhood was again marginalized. And many of the figures who had come to power and popularity after the Arab Spring were not able to run, or were effectively sidelined by being imprisoned or intimidated into silence. And so the Muslim Brotherhood has gone kind of back into the shadows a bit in Egypt, and a secularist government very closely tied to the military has continued to rule that country. The situation is certainly, I think, better and freer than it was under Mubarak, but there are still lots of issues to be worked out. And I mean, that in a way serves as a really good example of the effects of the Arab Spring. We could talk about Algeria or Tunisia or a lot of these other places that went through the Arab Spring. And, often the kind of revolutionary strides that were made were mitigated by extenuating circumstances and blunted, and the status quo was to some extent reestablished in most places, with some important changes made. So that's the state. Mohammed Morsi was initially sentenced to death, and that was commuted to, I believe, life in prison, and he's still there. I think he's awaiting retrial. But, the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi himself were, as I said, marginalized. South Africa in recent years. When Mandela was elected in 1994, he made it very clear that he was not going to take punitive action against the white, the white supremacist, the National Party government. That he was not going to do a lot of land redistribution or anything like that. There were definitely calls for radical solutions to the poverty that was experienced by so many black South Africans. But Mandela tried to unite the nation at the same time as he tried, through brokering international trade deals, to make South Africa even more of an economic powerhouse. the majority of the economy was still in the hands of the white population, although there was a great deal of white flight out of South Africa. In the latter years of the apartheid regime, the white population had dipped from a height of somewhere between 15 and 20%, I think, probably in the 1960s, to down around 10%. By the time it was around 10 or 11%, I think, when apartheid was toppled, and it, I think, has continued to shrink, partly due to the higher birth rate among the black population, and certainly due to a lot of immigration out of the country. I know a number of white South Africans, friends and acquaintances, and others who have moved to the United States, moved to Australia, moved to New Zealand, other places, and some of them just not able to kind of handle the transition away from apartheid. And so Mandela, tried to chart this course of peace and reconciliation. There was a commission convened by Desmond Tutu. He was appointed as the head of it, called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really more an airing of grievances than anything. A chance for the black population, which had been terrorized during apartheid, to hear what had happened to their loved ones who had disappeared, perhaps, or been killed while they were in police custody. As I said, there was, in an earlier lecture, there was a lot of secret police activity, a lot of clandestine, arrests, and people simply disappeared and were never heard from again. I mean, it's a tremendously complicated issue. I was living in South Africa when this began, and watched some of the proceedings on television, and it was a really kind of scarring thing. It was hoped to be a healing thing, and it probably was for some people, but it was also, I think, difficult for the nation to come to terms with all of the horrible things that had happened under apartheid. And there was, probably not a lot of forgiveness or healing that went along with that for a lot of people. Mandela did experience some successes. In 1995, the South African rugby team, the Springboks as they were called, a team composed almost entirely of white players. The rugby was, in some senses, the white sport of South Africa, while soccer or football was kind of seen as the black sport. And the rugby team, they did have one colored player, Chester Williams, who was one of the stars of the team, but everyone else was white, and many of them kind of from strictly Afrikaans backgrounds too. If you look at some of the names, they're very Dutch. But that team was backed by Mandela in the Rugby World Cup, and they managed to win the cup. It was held in South Africa, which was the sanctions against South Africa were lifted, and they were able to host and participate in international sporting events again after being denied that for a long time. And they won the Rugby World Cup over New Zealand. I was living there at the time. It was a tremendous national celebration. And because Mandela got behind the team, the entire country, including the black population, got behind the team. And as a kind of reciprocal thing, the South African team later, the next year, 1996, went on to win the Africa Cup of Nations, which is kind of the continent-wide soccer tournament. And that team was made up, almost entirely of black players. And that team was backed by, everyone in the country too. And there seemed to be, through sports, a kind of healing process going on and a national unification. But not all of the bad feelings were necessarily resolved by those sorts of things. When Mandela stepped down from the presidency after serving one term in 1999, he always said he was going to only serve one term. He was 81 years old by that point. He was in poor health because of the long time being imprisoned and having to undergo hard labor and unsanitary conditions, working in a stone quarry. Mandela was not in the best of health. He did live for another 14 years after that, kind of remarkably, but his health continued to deteriorate. And his deputy and one of the chief negotiators to the end of apartheid, Thabo Mbeki, who was pictured here on the slide. He's the guy on the left here. He took over as the president of South Africa, and there was a lot of confidence in Mbeki because he was an educated, well-spoken, very cultured and westernized person, politician of, I think, tremendous skill, and he took over as president. And things seemed to continue in very much the same vein as they had under Mandela. But people were growing increasingly restless, given the lack of for many. I mean, millions of South Africans were still living in shanty towns with few amenities, few services, no plumbing or fresh water or anything like that. They had to get water out of communal wells and dig their own latrines, and millions of them were living like this still, despite promises of the government to build a more electrical grid and sanitation systems and so forth. I mean, those things take time and money. And so there was greater and greater impatience. And as time went on, Mbeki made other mistakes. One of the biggest ones was during the AIDS crisis. In the early part of the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, Mbeki embraced a minority scientific opinion. To call it that is actually being nice. This is a complete sham, a kind of quack medicine that suggested that HIV and AIDS were not connected. And thus, retroviral drugs, which are really the only things effective at at mitigating the effects of HIV, preventing it, at least slowing the process of it developing to full-blown AIDS. Mbeki rejected all of that and even began to embrace conspiracy theories that the AIDS crisis was manufactured by the West in order to provide income for Western industries, specifically drug makers, to provide these drugs at great expense to poor African nations. Mbeki kind of went along with all of this. He appointed health officials who had little experience with these things, but who were conspiracy theorists of the same mind. And this caused an international scandal, international outrage, as the AIDS crisis continued to rage in South Africa. Again, more than 20% of the population at one point, it was estimated, were HIV positive in South Africa. And Mbeki later did backpedal to some extent on this, but not until a great deal of damage was done. And there were other things that led the population, and more specifically the members of the African National Congress, to lose faith in Mbeki. And Mbeki did win a second term in 2004, but his popularity continued to deteriorate, and this led to the rise of a rival political leader, also a member of the ANC, Jacob Zuma, who was pictured here by Mbeki. Zuma's a total contrast to Mbeki. Uneducated, coming from a rural background rather than a westernized, European university educated background like Mbeki was. But Zuma was a brilliant orator and a charismatic figure, and he rose to the leadership of the ANC, pressed in 2008 for a vote of no confidence in Mbeki by the party leadership, and that was passed. Mbeki stepped down from his leadership of the ANC and eventually stepped down from the presidency. There was an interim president for a few months, and then Zuma won an election in 2009, won again a second term in 2014. And Zuma, truth be told, followed a similar trajectory to Mbeki. Different issues, but Zuma was always dogged by accusations of corruption. It was shown that he had, for instance, used millions of rands or millions of dollars worth of state funds to build himself a mansion, to improve his homes, for other personal expenses. And so these corruption accusations dogged him. And in 2017, early 2018, he was, similar thing happened. Voted no confidence. Zuma stepped down from the presidency, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who was another kind of old ANC hand, assumed the presidency or won an election to the presidency. Rival oppositions have emerged to the ANC, specifically the Economic Freedom Fighter Party, under the leadership of Julius Malema, who was the former head of the ANC Youth League, and really a kind of fire breather. And some of the ANC party leadership has embraced Malema's calls for land redistribution. Ramaphosa and others are looking into this, and this may be the way that things proceed. In some ways, they're following the example of Robert Mugabe's regime in Zimbabwe in doing this. And truthfully, that was disastrous to the economy and the political situation in Zimbabwe. And so I suppose all of this, the course of this remains to be seen in South Africa. A couple of other case studies, and these, to some extent, darker circumstances. Terrible civil wars raged in the early 90s, and then again about a decade later in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone specifically had a couple of rounds of this. And dictatorial figures like Charles Taylor in Liberia committed unspeakable crimes. Child soldiers were used commonly in both of these civil wars. The rebel groups were able to, and to some extent even the government troops, employed child soldiers and slave laborers. And this is one of those places where the control of resources was key. Both Liberia and Sierra Leone have large diamond deposits, even like superficial diamond fields where people can literally pan for diamonds in rivers and things. The movie Blood Diamond, which I recommend highly, though, only for those who can take really kind of shocking and very sad stories. Anyway, that's another recommendation. But they employed slave labor to mine for these diamonds and enslaved both young boys and girls. The girls were turned into often sex slaves for the soldiers, and the boys were given AK-47s and turned into child soldiers, brainwashed, addicted to drugs. There's some really good memoirs of this. One from a Sierra Leonean named Ishmael Bea called A Long Way Gone. That's one I would highly recommend if you want to study this issue. Liberia and Sierra Leone are not the only places where child soldiers have been employed. Another is in Central Africa, beginning in Uganda and later kind of searching into Sudan and the Congo and the Central African Republic. The famous, infamous, notorious figure Joseph Kony, formed a really kind of a religious cult / rebel army called the Lord's Resistance Army. Kony declared himself to be, I believe, the resurrected Jesus Christ, and employed child soldiers and co-opted young girls into sex slavery for his army, and fought against the governments of multiple countries. This led in 2012 to a viral video on YouTube concocted by some college students in the United States to try to bring awareness about the crimes of Joseph Kony, and it raised huge funds. There was later somewhat of a scandal in the handling of the funds and some of the information disseminated. But this is, now an international issue, along with female genital mutilation, and there are several other kind of cow celebs in Africa to try to stop child soldiers and other atrocities like that. But this dates back to, a few decades, really. And Charles Taylor and others have been brought to justice using the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And so, international institutions of justice have gotten involved in these African affairs to some extent. Last and most disturbing case study is Rwanda. You're assigned this week to read Murambi, the Book of Bones, a terribly disturbing, I think, novel. What's interesting about this novel, and one of the things that I want you to think about as you read this and prepare the paper on it, is that this is written by a Senegalese author, a guy from West Africa, Mubarak Boris Diop. This was not written by a Rwandan. Okay. Why would a Senegalese author living half a continent away choose to write about the Rwandan genocide? Well, to some extent, and I think, as you look at the course of the story, the narrative, where you have this guy named Uvimana, Cornelius Uvimana, the protagonist of the story. His father, of course, is heavily involved in the genocide, ends up perpetrating massacres, even of his own wife and children who were Tutsi. But Cornelius is living at the time in Djibouti. He's out of the country. And he returns to Rwanda after the genocide with a kind of pan-African perspective on this, though also with an internal Rwandan perspective, because he grew up there. He's from Rwanda. And there's some tension between those two perspectives. Uvimana talks about, trying to discuss the genocide with his girlfriend in Djibouti. And, she says, well, these Tutsi and Hutus have been fighting each other from time out of mind. This is an eternal struggle for supremacy. And he says, no, you really have to start with 1959 and look at the colonial legacy, look at what the Belgians did with, their identification cards and their crafting of these ethnic identities. And really nobody wants to hear about this, right? There's also these accusations that he hears from other Africans that Rwanda is making the rest of Africa look bad. They hear about the Rwandan genocide and they say, well, Africans just like to kill each other, right? They're savages. Will you stop doing this? You're making us look bad to the international community. And so the question that I want you to contemplate in this prompt as I chew up my cough drop here is, does the Rwandan genocide in a way serve as a fitting metaphor for post-colonial African history? In other words, or another way to put it, does post-colonial Africa lead up to the Rwandan genocide? Is this in some ways an inevitable consequence of the mess created by the post-colonial situation, right? Or are there other ways of conceiving of African history? Is this just one long sequence of tragedies and atrocities and oppression and corruption? Or, are there other things that might define Africa? Are there things in the Rwandan genocide that in some ways complicate this issue, right? And so, you can approach this from a number of ways. A very conceptual paper. I can see that this could lead to some frustration among students. There is not one right way to do this or to interpret this, but I want you to deal with this. Of course, if you've written the first 3 papers, you don't necessarily have to write this, but I want you to think about this deeply, look at the evidence in the novel, try to come up with a way to approach that question. Okay. The Rwandan genocide has, of course, antecedents that go back before colonialism. There were pastoralists and agriculturalists. They existed in certainly some harmony, but also some tension, as the pastoralists exerted political authority over the agriculturalists for the most part, but those categories were very fluid. They were crystallized under the Belgians, and the Belgians, of course, co-opted the Tutsis to be the ruling elite under the colonial regime. But then they did this about face and told the Rwandans they had to have democratic elections. And of course, the Hutus, who now had their firm Hutu identity because the Belgians kind of forced them to adopt that, in order to get back at the Tutsis, swept into power, carried out massacres, drove many of the Tutsis out of Rwanda into Burundi, into other parts of the world, really. And this process continued. In Burundi, it was the opposite. The Tutsis seized control of the power and drove many Hutus into Rwanda, and there's this kind of reciprocal and increasingly destructive relationship between those two countries. Lots of discrimination, quotas placed on Tutsis that they couldn't occupy more than a certain number, a certain percentage of jobs, especially skilled positions like doctors and university professors and engineers and so forth and so on in Rwanda, even though the Tutsis by and large had greater access to education and a higher standard of living, so to speak, historically than the Hutus did. And they also developed a kind of hate speech. The Tutsis were called Inyenzi by the Hutus, which means cockroaches. They were seen as a kind of infestation of vermin that should be exterminated. There was a lot of preparation leading up to this, a lot of posturing, a lot of rhetoric. Mass media got involved in this. There were hate speech programs on national radio stations in Rwanda throughout the 70s and 80s. And this came to a head in around 1990 when a Tutsi group sponsored by the government of Uganda, consisting largely of Tutsis who had been forced out of the country, or whose parents had been forced out of the country in 1959 or in subsequent years, and who had grown up in Uganda, led by a fellow named Paul Kagame, who was born, actually, I believe, in Uganda, and kind of grew up with the guy who came to power in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. And so this group called the Rwandese Patriotic Front, or the RPF, attacked along the northern border of Rwanda, trying to oust the government of the Hutu hardliner Juvenal Habyarimana. And this led to a civil war that went on for about 4 years, starting for this 1990 rebellion. On April 6th, 1994, a plane carrying Habyarimana and, by the way, the president of Burundi, who was a Tutsi, was shot down as it was flying into Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. And it's uncertain who did this. Habyarimana had made some concessions. There had been peace talks in Arusha in Tanzania, brokered by the Tanzanian government, to some extent monitored by the United Nations, to try to produce a ceasefire to this civil war. So, Habyarimana was seen by some, certainly a lot of Hutu hardliners, as a sellout. And so it's quite possible, and in fact the official government position is that the plane was shot down by the Interahamwe. Okay, the Interahamwe is this kind of paramilitary group that had developed in the 70s and 80s, and had grown in popularity, made up largely of young men, often unemployed young men, Hutus who saw their ills in the presence of the Tutsi, and who began to make preparations by importing arms, mostly cheap Chinese-made machetes, to prepare for the massacre that they were promised would come of the Tutsis. When the plane was shot down, the official declaration was made by the leadership of the Interahamwe, and even to some extent by Hutu hardliners in the government, that the time had come for the massacres to take place. The army got involved in this to some extent, but at the very least, the army stayed out of the way. Often, and they were still fighting the RPF on the front. Some members of the army got involved in the massacres. It was really a free-for-all for a long time. The massacres started in Kigali in April, and over the course of a few weeks, Nearly the entire Tutsi population of Kigali was slaughtered, those who were not able to flee into the countryside. Roadblocks were set up, and eventually the Interahamwe just went house to house and found Tutsis and slaughtered them. Lots of Hutu moderates, Hutus who had married Tutsis or had Tutsi friends, were targeted as well. I mean, it's one of the most horrific sequences of events in human history. Now, from there, the slaughters moved into the countryside. The Interahamwe leadership began to co-opt local farmers, Hutus, to slaughter their Tutsi neighbors. The Tutsis would flee into the bush and be tracked down. They had to hide in swamps and in trees and other places. Some of them, ended up dying of exposure or contracted diseases or other things there. I don't want to go into some of the grisly details. I teach a class periodically with my colleague, Dr. Vandenhouten, on the history of genocide, and I've read far more than I probably ever should have read on the Rwandan genocides, personal accounts of these sorts of things. Trust me, simply to say that it's beyond horrific what happened there. Over the course of about 100 days, somewhere around 800,000, possibly as many as 1 million or more, Tutsis and Hutu moderates were killed, most of them by being hacked to death by machete. You can see the picture here of a survivor who, was beaten and cut up by machetes, but managed to survive somehow. Mass rapes were carried out of Tutsi women. There were entire rape camps set up for the pleasure of the Interahamwe leaders, and just lots and lots of horrific things. The genocide, frankly, was only stopped by the invasion of the RPF. They managed to take Kigali and forced the leadership of the Interahamwe, and in fact, probably more than 1 million, maybe close to 2 million Hutus out of the country. They fled, fearing that they would be targeted as genocidaires, as participants in the genocide, and frankly, a huge proportion of the population had taken part in some way or another, right? Or they had been forced to by the Interahamwe. There were often kind of loyalty tests that if you are indeed a Hutu, you will kill these Tutsi where I can, see you do it. And so even, fathers were forced to carry out slaughters of their own children if they had married Tutsis, or mothers, vice versa. I mean, terrible, terrible things. And so about, 1.5 million or something like that, Hutus fled into the eastern Congo. The international community did almost nothing to halt the genocide. In fact, they in some ways exacerbated the genocide. They did have a peacekeeping force there to monitor the ceasefire that had taken place so these negotiations could happen in Arusha. And it was under the leadership of a Canadian general, but it was a UN peacekeeping force. And despite the objections of the Canadian general Romeo Dallaire, after the genocide started, the international community pressed for the soldiers to be removed. Dallaire was eventually left with only a few hundred soldiers. They did set up a ring around the Hotel Mikoline in the center of Kigali. This sequence of events is the subject of the movie Hotel Rwanda, another one I highly, highly recommend watching at some point if you can handle the subject matter. And anyway, they stripped this force of really any way to halt the genocide from happening. There's some truly heroic things that did happen, some heroic figures, Rwandans and others, some international figures who stayed there as members of the Red Cross or other organizations who died with their charges or protected them in some way. Certainly Paul Rusesabagina, who was the manager of the Hotel Mikoline, is a great hero in all of this. He was played famously by Don Cheadle in Hotel Rwanda. But the end of the genocide happened, and the RPF ended up in power. And a million and a half Hutu refugees were now in the eastern Congo. Well, with the support of Uganda, the RPF eventually carried out invasions into the eastern Congo to try to target the genocidaires. And this, together with the weakening of the Mobutu regime in Zaire, led ultimately to a tremendously complicated war called the Congolese War, or alternately known as the Africa's World War. It's called that because eventually something along the lines of like 12 nations got involved in this. Some of them taking part militarily, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and others providing support for first the Mobutu regime and eventually the Kabila regime. There was regime change. Mobutu was ousted from power. He was sick and near to death anyway. And his successor was Laurent Kabila, who was not necessarily the most popular or the less corrupt. He was initially supported by the Rwandans who wanted to see regime change and wanted the permission to continue to carry out reprisal killings, reprisal attacks on the Hutu population in eastern Congo. But Kabila turned against the Rwandans with the support of others. Angola, Zimbabwe, South Africa, others provided logistical or diplomatic support to one side or the other in all of this. And I mean, this is a tremendously complicated thing. There's a really good book that tries to simplify it, and I think it does a pretty good job, called Dancing in the Glory of Monsters by Jason Stearns. That's another one I would recommend reading. I've taught this class as a learning community with Dr. Kaufman's Intro to International Studies class, and she has the students read that book in that class. So I recommend that one. And this war continued for 5 years or so, with later outbreaks of violence into the next decade, and mass rapes. It eventually was so complicated. I mean, there were several different groups all kind of fighting against each other. The Congo, Kabila changed the name back to the Congo from Zaire. The Congo is tremendously rich in resources, especially mineral resources. And so a rebel group controlling a single mine that produces coltan or cobalt, and with the ability to trade on the international market in these things, could exist indefinitely, could buy arms with the proceeds of a single mine that they use slave labor of the local population to procure the resources from. And then these rebel armies carry out killings of their rivals. The civilians are the ones who suffer from this, especially women, I think, because they were so subject to sexual violence and all of this. The numbers of women who have been raped, sometimes repeatedly, and even young girls as young as 4 or 5 years old in some cases, who have been raped, is just staggeringly high in the Congo. The majority or more, even in some areas, have suffered this horrible scourge due to the Congolese War. This is not something that made a lot of international news, to be truthful, and that's a real shame. That's a travesty because of the extent of the atrocities and faults on, I think, many sides. It's certainly understandable why the RPF would want to attack those who had nearly killed off their ethnic population, but on the other hand, the RPF did take this pretty far in massacring and eventually supporting rebel groups to destabilize the Congo, and a lot of atrocities occurred from that. There were attempts made to bring the participants in the genocide to justice. So often some really kind of creative measures taken, in fact. Some of the kind of ringleaders were arrested and brought to trial in the International Criminal Court, convened not in The Hague this time, but rather in Arusha in Tanzania, which has been called the Geneva of Africa. Though these proceedings were slow and often kind of got bogged down in legal details, and these leaders of the genocide were often kind of put up in nice accommodations for years awaiting trial, and that was seen as a somewhat unjust thing. I mean, they were in prison, but they had access to health care and other things. And so, this was, while some of their victims, ended up, women ended up pregnant with babies that were the result of rape. People certainly were left with physical and emotional and mental scars for the rest of their lives from all of this. And so there was a lot of frustration with the Arusha proceedings. In Rwanda itself, the RPF government came up with a local system of justice called the Kachaca Courts. That sounds like a dance, but that's Gacaca, Gachaca. And these were in some ways like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Anyone could denounce another person, and they carried out, sort of rhetorical attacks and defenses with local juries chosen to determine the guilt or innocence. And this was far more efficient and much faster than these international criminal proceedings. I think that we could call them a success, though almost certainly there were travesties of justice in some cases. But I think by and large, the Gacaca worked really, really well. Paul Kagame has attempted to turn Rwanda into, he's called it the Singapore of Africa. Tried to sponsor a lot of trade, a kind of high-tech industry even in Rwanda. Tried to open Rwanda to the rest of the world. Kagame has had a lot of backers in the West, especially in the United States. He is a frequent visitor to the U.S. and to some university campuses. He's popular at Stanford, I know, and some other places. His English is excellent. He did spend time in the U.S. In military training. And Kagame, in fact, has changed Rwanda's official language from, everybody speaks Kinyarwanda, but French was the colonial language. It's now English is the official language, I believe, of the government. And at the same time, Kagame has presided over one of the most secretive and really closed regimes in the world. It almost rivals North Korea in some ways. Maybe that's putting it a little too harshly. But, Kagame definitely has no willingness to share power. He initially was just a vice president, but eventually secured the presidency and has remained in power ever since, with little opposition attempted, and any opposition really sort of cracked down upon and silenced. And so there's a trade-off with Rwanda, right? It's a much more peaceful place, lots of economic opportunities. Rwanda is rich in resources despite its small size. It's pretty dense in population still, but at the same time, it's ruled over by a secretive and we might say shady regime, at least in some senses of the word. Okay, if you have questions about any of these things, or you want to bring up other countries that you read about in the textbook or that you know about, feel free to do that on the discussion boards. Let's spend a few minutes talking about Africa's future. One of the big questions, politically speaking, is democracy possible in Africa, right? There are huge challenges that Africa faces. If you look at the satellite, kind of composite satellite image of Africa here, and compare it with Europe or even kind of the Middle East, right? You can see the lands around Mecca and Medina, the pilgrimage lands of Islam here. Look up here at Israel, Palestine, even here in the Middle East around the Persian Gulf, the Gulf states. There's a lot of lights here, a lot of development. I mean, Europe is just awash in all of this, right? You can see London and Paris and the Ruhrgebiet and Venice over here, and some of these places. Even Russia, right, has a lot of these huge population centers. Rwanda, Africa, the Nile Valley is all lit up. You can see Johannesburg and Pretoria down here, and Durban and Cape Town. Certainly, along the coast of Nigeria here, Lagos, and some of these other places. Kinshasa down here, right? There's Accra, and along the coast up here. But this is the Congo, right? The geographic challenges remain there that have always been an obstacle to the development of human societies in Africa, right? And that doesn't necessarily cancel out the possibility of democracy. It just makes it difficult, especially in a country so large and geographically complex as the Congo, or as ethnically divided as Nigeria, or for that matter, Rwanda or Burundi, right? Even though there are only a couple of ethnicities there. These are huge challenges. Can African countries produce a credible opposition to the liberation movement political parties? That's one of the great questions. In some cases, opposition movements have appeared, but they often fall into ethnic categories, and the dominant ethnicity is always going to command give their loyalty to the party that most closely coheres with their ethnic identity. This is definitely the case in Kenya, for instance, where the Kikuyu have dominated politics despite the objections of the minority groups, the Luo and the Maasai and others, these ethnic divisions have remained, and that is a challenge to producing any kind of credible opposition. There's still a great deal of appeal, as we've seen in just recent days with the Zimbabwe election in the summer of 2018, that despite decades of corruption by the ZANU-PF party government under Robert Mugabe, that under a new leader in Zimbabwe, once Mugabe was ousted, that the ZANU-PF still wins the majority of the seats in parliament, right? That is a great example of the persistence of these liberation movement parties. The ANC in South Africa, I think, is another one. We're more than 2 decades on now from the end of apartheid, and the ANC still has no really serious challenger in South Africa. They still win every election with a supermajority of the seats in parliament. Patronage and cronyism, will that continue, or will that be done away with? Can there be ever a separation between state and party? It's moving in that direction in some parts of Africa, but without a credible opposition, the party and the state will continue to be coterminous. The military veto, right? The militaries often prop up these regimes, or if they become dissatisfied with the ruling, the rulers, the civilian rulers, they will simply pull off a coup d'etat, and there will be a transition to military leadership, and then the military leaders will then, retire and become civilians and run for office and win with the backing of the military, and the military really stays in power. Is the military going to continue to veto, serve as a kind of veto to elections, or can African countries move in a different direction? And ultimately, can there just be a conceptual shift away from the status quo and, as we've seen, away from the traditional way of wielding political power, which relies on incentives and networks and often ethnic identifications and other things? Can there be a move away from that to some more viable, more peaceful, less potential for corruption method to all of this? Economic questions. What are the effects of globalism on Africa? That remains to be seen, right? The technological revolution has made it to Africa. It is perhaps less apparent there, but more and more Africans are getting online. They're getting access to smartphones. They are sort of sampling what the world has to offer. They're participating in discussions with people all around the world, traveling in some cases and bringing ideas back to Africa. And I mean, this is having a dramatic effect. The Arab Spring is a good example of the effects of technology and social media and globalization on Africa, and there are lots of other examples that we could draw from as well. The control of minerals and other liquid resources, right? There have been far too many cases of the control of these things ending up in the hands of corrupt officials or rebel groups, using nefarious tactics like employing child soldiers and selling these, to shady firms from other parts of the world, including in some cases American firms. The U.S. Economy has not been squeaky clean, certainly with this, in this respect. And being able to operate, being able to import arms and continue conflicts and continue to commit atrocities with those things. The whole blood diamond, there were lots of protests against blood diamonds back in the 90s. And yet, conflict minerals have continued to be, frequently coming out of Africa. What is the role of the state in the economy, right? For decades, African countries tried state control of resources. That didn't work very well for most of them. The socialist experiments were abandoned to one extent or another with the insistence upon these structural adjustment programs. Those have yet to run their full course. How much control will the state continue to have? That's a great question going forward. International aid, right? I think that more and more African intellectuals and even political leaders have come around to the idea that Africa needs to solve its own problems. It cannot rely on international aid. Often international aid is ineffectual anyway. One of my favorite podcasts I've ever listened to, or rather this was a TED Talk, was this Italian aid worker who had, I believe, worked in either Zambia or Zimbabwe. And, this was an Italian aid agency, as I said, and they went into these villages in southern Africa, and they decided they wanted to teach these people how to farm. And being Italians, they said, well, we'll teach them to grow tomatoes and zucchini, good Italian vegetables that can be, used in making spaghetti and antipasto and things like that. And so they planted tomatoes, they planted zucchini, and these plants grew wonderfully, and they couldn't seem to get the African locals to help with this, and so they decided to pay them. And these people would show up for work, but they weren't terribly enthusiastic about it. And these aid workers had the impression that these Africans were just lazy, or they didn't understand why they were doing this. They weren't catching the spirit of it. They didn't get why this wasn't happening, because these tomato plants were growing beautifully. And then one day they went out, as these tomatoes were just about to ripen, and they saw this group of hippos emerge from the river close by. And they came, and within like 2 minutes had eaten up every single tomato and zucchini plant that the aid workers had planted, and worked so hard at maintaining, and had employed these African locals to work on. And while this was happening, they were like shouting to the locals, saying, the hippos, what are they doing? And basically the response of the African locals was, yeah, we knew this was going to happen. This is what happens when we plant crops. The hippos come and eat them when they get ripe, right? This is why we don't plant crops like this here. And it became apparent that this aid agency really needed to consult with the locals to figure out what would work, that they had a pretty good sense, that they weren't ignorant of how to, eke out a living from the soil. But they understood that some efforts would be absolutely futile, given the lay of the land, given the wildlife and other things that pose challenges to this, right? And this aid worker went on to say that they started to look at what other aid agencies were doing, and they were actually quite pleased that they at least had fed the hippos, because other aid agencies were doing absolutely nothing of value to help the Africans. And he came around to the idea that we really need to have conversations with people. We need to consult with them. They need to come up with the solutions to their problems. And if we're going to give them aid, it needs to be logistical and monetary support. to pursue the answers that they know will work, that they work out themselves. African solutions to African problems is kind of the catchphrase here. And I think that that's where things are going. But Africa is still a place very much that offers good photo ops for aid agencies to show that they're doing good in some poor benighted corner of the world, right? And if this is all about the PR of an international aid group, then the aid is probably going to continue to be ineffectual and end up probably in the wrong hands, and not really do much to help and potentially exacerbate the problems there. Can there be new sources of income to the national economies of these African nations? Are they going to continue to rely on the same resources, on cash crops in some cases, or minerals? Can private interests in Africa, or even the public sector, come up with new ways of earning money on the globalized international market? I think that remains to be seen. The more diverse these economies become, the stronger they will be, arguably. Hopefully that is, and I think that we can see this to some extent already in places like Nigeria, where there's a great deal of economic opportunity. There's, Lagos has become a kind of high-tech hub, and also a place for, a film industry, a publishing industry, and lots of other things coming out of Nigeria. I think that we can see similar developments in other places like India that mirror what's going on in Africa at the same time. Cultural and social questions. What's going to be? What are the effects of religious fundamentalism, whether Christian or Muslim? What are these going to be long term? Right? Are more groups like Boko Haram and Al Qaeda and the more radicalized elements of the Muslim Brotherhood or ISIS, are these going to continue to be popular in Muslim areas and supported by populations, or is there going to be a kind of backlash against the fundamentalism? I think to some extent that stretches into politics and economics. The more corruption, the more ineffectual the economy and the government is, the more likelihood that fundamentalist strains of religious loyalists will thrive as a kind of counter to what the government or the economy is not providing. Can Africa export culture? Can this be a potential source of income, or at least a way to bring Africa to the minds of people? Africa still has this reputation for being primitive and backward, and wild and corrupt and all of that, right? Can Africa sort of hold its own on the cultural line and be respected culturally as much as any other part of the world, on its own terms, frankly? And I see promising signs there, but as more African, producers of culture, whether artists or musicians or playwrights or literary figures, whatever, gain respect in the international community, the better off Africa is going to be in general. And there are positive signs, but there are some definite headwinds there too. The AIDS crisis and other public health problems, malaria for that matter. Jeffrey Sachs, the famous Columbia University economist, one of the great thinkers on the developing world over the last few decades, came up with the bed net solution, that a $5 bed net, could save the life of a child who would otherwise contract malaria from mosquitoes. And there were massive efforts made to supply bed nets, but often these things were not used effectively. They weren't used properly. They didn't end up in the right hands. They ended up languishing and simply not being used in warehouses or in some forgotten corner of somebody's home. There are great public health solutions that have been proposed, but these aren't always carried out in Africa effectively. Can there be a breakthrough, to the effective distribution of such aid solutions, or can there be African solutions to some of these crises? Better educational programs, better embracing of retroviral drugs, maybe even African companies producing their own retroviral drugs, so they're not so reliant on Western firms for this. And in the case where more money is leaving Africa going to other parts of the world, that's been a problem for a long time now. So I think we can see, to sum up this, and this is the last point, I guess, old and new problems, right? Lots of the same problems or the same issues that have animated African history going back to the most ancient periods are continuing to animate Africa today. At the same time, there are new problems of overpopulation in some places. That's never been a problem in Africa until the last half century, maybe 3/4 of a century. It is becoming a major problem in some parts of Africa. Nigeria is vastly overpopulated. There are other urban centers like Cairo and Johannesburg that are arguably overpopulated and maxing out the resources of these countries. These are new things. These are problems of modernity, and they're clashing with the traditional problems, right? And so I'll leave you with that as a puzzle here. Tradition and modernity, old and new problems, African history to some extent coming full circle. And hopefully this has been a valuable experience for you. Hopefully you are at least interested in this continent and want to learn more about it. If I have done that, then I feel like I've done my job well. So I look forward to seeing your comments on the discussion board and reading what you've written about the Book of Bones and on the final exam and other things. Thank you.